This is 9/11 Freefall.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of 9/11 Freefall. I'm the host, Andy Steele. Guest tonight is Lewis Wolf. He's back on the program tonight to talk about Bill Schaap, who was the attorney for AE 9/11 Truth, who unfortunately passed away a few weeks ago. Bill had an amazing career as an activist, somebody that did what he could to stand up for the little man against the big machine throughout the decades of American history that he was a part of, way back from the Vietnam War era to the state we find ourselves in here now in the post-9/11 world. Bill has been there. Lewis is going to be talking about him. He was a friend of Bill Schaap. They worked together. Lewis Wolf, of course, is a news correspondent and writer. He founded the CovertAction Bulletin, later renamed CovertAction Quarterly, and the Rock Creek Free Press. He's able to talk about Bill and just about the issues that Bill championed as they lived them largely in many cases together and did a lot of great stuff for this country. So I'll be playing that in just a minute or so. You're going to notice that the sound quality on this interview is not as good as the other episodes that have played over the previous year. That is because the recorder that usually picks up my voice and delivers my voice in a clear, crisp way for you didn't work. It only caught like every other third word that I said, so you wouldn't be able to understand what I had to say if I dubbed that in. So you're going to be stuck listening to me talking in the old way over the phone to the guests, just like the original 9/11 Freefall broadcast. So we're getting a little retro tonight. I'm going to have the problem worked out for next week's episode, though, so don't worry. This is not going to be the norm. I don't think it makes much of a difference anyway. You can totally understand what I'm saying. You can understand what the guest is saying, more importantly. And you're also going to notice that this interview tonight goes into areas that we don't normally go into here on 9/11 Freefall. We usually just focus on the science of the building demolitions in New York on 9/11, not other issues. But Lou is such an interesting guy that I want to hear it. I just want to hear him talk about all of these things that he has learned so much about over the years and talk about them in relation to Bill Schaap. So just a reminder, as our disclaimer always says, opinions expressed by guests and myself on issues outside of the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence are our own and don't reflect those of AE 9/11 Truth. All right, before I play my interview with Lewis Wolf, we're going to do what we do every week. We're going to take 10 seconds of silence to remember the victims of 9/11, their families, and all the people who died in the wars that followed 9/11. We'll do that beginning now. And that's 10 seconds.
The views expressed on this show by guests and the host on issues outside of the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence are the opinions of those individuals alone and do not necessarily reflect those of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth.
Lewis Wolf is a news correspondent and writer. He's a founder of the CovertAction Bulletin, which was later renamed the CovertAction Quarterly, and of the Rock Creek Free Press. His work has focused on researching and documenting the crimes and human costs of the activities and operations of U.S. intelligence apparatus, including its involvement in 9/11, which is, of course, a very huge crime and has touched a lot of lives. That's why we talk about it every week on this show. But Lewis, welcome back to 9/11 Freefall.
Thank you so much, Andy. I really appreciate and I'm proud to honor Bill Schaap today. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's the reason Lewis is on. We lost another great warrior for 9/11 Truth. Bill Schaap recently passed away on February the 25th. So we'll be talking about Bill today, talking about some of the stuff Bill did throughout his career, because he worked directly with you, Louis. So I guess we're going to just jump right into it. Tell our audience a little bit about Bill Schaap and what he did in life.
Bill, who I first met in 1977 when I moved to Washington, and he and his late wife Ellen, who only died a few months ago as well, they were partners for 44 wonderful years, and I understand from friends of Bill that his last weeks he was always constantly talking about Ellen. Bill was one of a kind as a journalist, as an activist, as a historian. He certainly understood the thrust of history better than almost anybody I can think of, maybe along the lines of a Noam Chomsky or Howard Zinn. He really had a long history in this kind of work. First as an attorney overseas in Japan and Okinawa, helping GIs who were involved in, some of them were recruited under false pretenses. Some of them understood that as members of the military, they didn't want to kill people. They didn't believe in the false premises that are always put up to that as in the military you're defending the American way of life. Bill rejected that 200%, and he understood a lot of the lies that justify U.S. interventions around the world. And so that's how we came together, he and his wife Ellen, to co-found together with Philip Agee, the former CIA man who blew the whistle on the CIA after 14 years in Latin America as a operations officer with the CIA. Phil Agee left the CIA. He had been thinking of leaving for some time, but finally, not just leaving, resigning. And it's not that easy to leave the CIA when you're there. But it was when he was sitting in the office of the chief of police in Montevideo, Uruguay, and he heard somebody screaming in the next room, and he put two and two together, and he realized this man was being tortured, and he asked the chief, Jefe, what is that? And he said, "Oh, Felipe, don't you remember? You turned him over to us last week," and he gave the name. And I think that was for Phil the straw that finally broke the camel's back, as it were, and he decided to leave the CIA. But again, it took several years to do that. You don't just walk out of the building and leave. But he became a very clearly in his own mind and in his writings, legion as they are, he became a socialist, he became an anti-imperialist, and he rejected all of the, I'll use the four-letter word that begins with S, that he had been involved in. And he denounced it and he renounced it. So, knowing Phil, I first met him in London in 1975, and he and Ellen Ray and Bill Schaap and I later were to found the magazine CovertAction, first called CovertAction Information Bulletin, then CovertAction Quarterly. Bill Schaap and Ellen Ray, they were just like peas in a pod. They really were fighters of the first order, fighters against the imperialist system as it is and was at the time. He taught me so much, and as did Ellen, about the thrust of American policy, about the thousands of military bases, then somewhat less, but today it's over 1,000 U.S. bases around the world. In fact, the Pentagon and the National Security Council are constantly looking for new sites, for new bases, and in new countries where they haven't had bases before. And so one of the places that Ellen and Bill went was in Okinawa, next door to Japan, and where there's a great deal of activity, grassroots activity against the U.S. military presence there. And there are constant cases of rape of their women by U.S. military personnel. There's frequently people dying at the hands of military personnel after they're drinking and carousing. It's the same wherever the U.S. military lands. That's what happens. I've lived in the Philippines for years, and that I saw it there as well. And Ellen and Bill founded a coffee house there for GIs who they were working with and they were defending, and he was known as never having, as far as I'm aware, never having lost a case that he took on as an attorney, and that's I don't know how many hundred cases he lawyered through the system. But that's quite a testament to his legal skills as well as to his commitment.
You know, it's interesting what you say about the negative effects of U.S. military presence in various countries. I remember when I first really started looking into what was going on in the Iraq War, beyond what I was just seeing on the news and the positive spin that was being put on a lot of what was going on. When I was watching stuff on YouTube, watching 18-year-old kids, one video that stuck out with me was seeing some young soldiers shooting a dog in an alley. Now, even if you don't care about the dog, just the fact that they're shooting these rounds off in the middle of a city for sport, disrupting the peace, shows a real irresponsibility. And then, you step back and you think, well, they're just kids. They're 18 years old, and they're being put in a position to essentially be the overseers, the peacekeepers, the conquerors, whatever you want to call it. But most 18-year-old boys don't necessarily have the wisdom of King Solomon to be presiding all over these conquered people. What do you expect is going to happen? And Michael Moore actually had a good line in Fahrenheit 9/11 about that. I don't have the direct quote in front of me, but essentially it boiled down to when you have presidents that lie us into wars, that trickles down, and it leads to bad behavior in all of the ranks below it, and you end up with what we've seen. So I just wanted to share that off of that thought, and it sounds like Bill reflected that in his work and in his life too. And it's too bad we didn't get to hear more of those voices in the lead up to things like Iraq. Those voices existed, but the internet was still growing, reaching up to the sun here, and a lot of people didn't get to hear these kinds of counter arguments in the lead up to that. What was Bill saying in the lead up to like Afghanistan and Iraq as those were coming up?
Well, I can't quote him precisely, but I do remember him and standing with him in front of the White House at rallies, anti-war rallies, when over several million people worldwide stood against the U.S. invasion of Iraq. I think it was a huge historical precedent. The numbers of people around the globe who mobilized against that intervention. That invasion. Intervention is too mild a word. And one of the things and he used to be a speaker, a featured speaker, along with others in front of the White House. And one of the things I remember him saying is, "Don't believe the lies. Don't believe what they're telling us." And so he was not just an attorney, a people's attorney, but he was an historian as well. He actually joined, after he got his law degree, he was first with actually a Wall Street firm, Fried, Frank, Harris, Shriver, and Jacobson. And during that time, he joined the National Lawyers Guild, which is a very progressive, radical guild, nationwide lawyers organization. and his commitment to civil rights and anti-war and leftist political causes deepened through that period. In 1968, when Columbia University students were arrested for occupying a building on the campus, Bill Schaap represented and got many of them released from jail. So he made his mark early on. And then William Kunstler, I'm sure many of your listeners know that name. Bill Kunstler was an extraordinary attorney. We all miss him very, very much. He was the president of the Center for Constitutional Rights. And Bill Kunstler asked Bill Schaap to join the Center for Constitutional Rights and to head a project to defend U.S. military resistors to the Vietnam War. Bill left the Wall Street firm, and he and Ellen, his wife, then, as I said, spent years. It was 3 years in Japan, and then also in Germany, as well as in Okinawa, counseling and military GI resistors. It actually is odd to remember that he had no previous training in military law. He was a lawyer, but not a military lawyer. It's or to work within the military, the so-called Universal Code of Military Justice, or the UCMJ. Those in the military who had to face that UCMJ know it's not a whole lot about justice, similarly to the justice system that affects civilians in this country. And then in 1976, Ellen and Bill moved to Washington, and he became the editor of the Military Law Reporter, which was a very strong advocate for the rights of people in the military. Remember, when you join the military, they own your body, they own your entire being. You have no freedom to think for yourself. And then they train you to kill. I remember listening to a man who was sent against his will to Vietnam, and he reminded those of us there of what he had been exposed to at Fort Bragg in his initial training. And they were standing in an open field, and there was a table in front of them, the officer, and he was petting this beautiful rabbit in front of him, and then all of a sudden he grabbed the rabbit by the ears, pulled the knife out of his hip pocket, and disemboweled the rabbit. And then he said, "Yeah, boys, this is what you go to do in Vietnam." So just picture that and understand what they were being trained to do. They were not sent on so-called humanitarian missions. They were sent to kill people. And many, though certainly not enough, but many people in the military at that time, for various reasons and factors, they decided, this is not where I want to be. This is not what I want to be part of. And so they began to frack their soldiers. Frack their officers. They'd roll a grenade through a tent where the officers were sleeping, and they'd kill 3 or 4 or 5 of them. Of course, needless to say, those people who did that, those military personnel who did that, had to pay a price, and many of them went to prison. Some of them went AWOL and were not seen again. But that's all part of what happened within the military in Vietnam. As well, I should point out, as heavy use of drugs, which became rampant in the military. For those listeners who don't know, the U.S. Some personnel were actually sewing up the corpses of their fellow soldiers, planting drugs inside of their bodies, and they were shipped home. And it was all a coordinated system with people back in the U.S. to receive. They knew exactly the name and the tag, the military number that was on their dog tags, and they'd receive the body and take it somewhere else and remove the drugs, and then send that poor guy to his grave. So, Bill and his wife Ellen really saw the whole picture and understood it for what it was.
I mean, that is so awful. I've heard that claim, and I haven't really even looked too much into it, but a lot of people have said that about planting the drugs on the bodies and sending them home. What you're saying about torturing animals to get ready for combat is something that has been mirrored by another guest who has been on the show a couple of times, Dale Pierce, whose son Noah had gone off to Iraq and came back, severe PTSD, unfortunately took his own life, but he said, according to his son, that they would torture animals, puppies, to get ready to go do combat, go do what they needed to do out there in the field, according to their superiors. It's a terrible thing, and it takes some special people, especially back then, when it must have been even more difficult to be anti-war. At least I would think, because you're coming off of the high of World War II, all of that gung-ho patriotism, all of that American pride over having essentially just conquered the world, to stand out and challenge it. And you didn't have a lot of outlets. At least it didn't seem like you did. But society was a lot different then, I guess, too. People talked more to each other than now. Everything's on the internet now. So,
I think we should call out the mythology that surrounds the returning military personnel from Vietnam, who the official story, the popular story of how they were received is that they were screamed at and yelled at, and people threw eggs at them and swore at them and called them names and so forth. Actually, if you go back and look at a lot of the newsreels of that period, yes, there was that, certainly was, but there were many of them who many people in the U.S. in the anti-war movement who understood how those men, remember, it was mostly men, almost entirely men, a few women, though they weren't authorized to participate in military operations. Mostly they were there as nurses or other kinds of other kinds of work that they were trained to do. So it was almost entirely military men in the military at that time. But it should really be remembered that the anti-war movement, which took hold in this country, and thousands upon thousands of people were involved, actually several million if you really look at the numbers. And many of those military personnel ended up throwing their medals, the medals that they had gotten for whatever they did, over the fence at the Capitol building or at the Pentagon. One famous case, of course, is the former Secretary of State, now Secretary of State John Kerry, who claimed he threw his medals over the fence at the Capitol. Well, it later turned out that a journalist who went to interview him at the Department of State said in the office, Senator Kerry, are those the medals you threw over the fence? And Kerry blushed and said, well, actually, yes. So the history of the anti-war movement and the role of former military personnel is very important. It wasn't just non-military students and people who weren't in the military who were against it. It was also large numbers of military people as well, former military people. And so there were all these coffee houses throughout military bases overseas, particularly in Germany, in the Philippines, where I was working, in throughout bases in Europe and in this country. And I would say probably in the range of over several hundred coffee houses where people would meet, personnel would meet and drink coffee and talk about their experiences in the military. And then, of course, the newspapers, anti-war newspapers that GIs produced. I was involved with one of them in the Philippines called the WIG. Sorry, my dog here. The WIG, which was named after the Whig Party in the 19th century. And so, we have to understand that to fight within the military against the military system and the military rules and regulations, which are profoundly anti-democratic, it's not easy. It's not at all easy. And many people have learned it the hard way because they weren't able to get out of the military, and they did their 3 or 4 years, and some of them, unfortunately, were killed. Many of them were killed, or came back maimed with all kinds of injuries, some seen and others unseen. The fact that today, finally, the military has to acknowledge not only that we used Agent Orange, which they denied for many years, and the effects of Agent Orange in Vietnam. I remember at the beginning of the struggle against Agent Orange, the military said, "Agent what?" We didn't use. There was no such thing there. Well, they didn't use just Agent Orange. They had at least 7 or 8 colors of the rainbow, different agents, different kinds of chemicals that were being used in Vietnam, as well as in Laos and Cambodia. Sorry, my dog has a dog toy here. I have to get it out. Take it away from her. So, and then of course the fact that nowadays it's becoming better and better known of the injuries which are again invisible to the eye that people are taking inside of their brains from the effects of the explosives that are used. And the military, strangely, is now trying to deflect the public's knowledge of this, and they're saying, just deal with it to the men. And I've talked to veterans who've come back with these traumatic brain injuries, as they're called, TBIs. They're just told, deal with it, get over it. I'm sorry, that's Orwellian. That's to tell a man that it's all in your head. Well, it is all in their head, but it's not an imaginary issue.
Well, I don't think people can just deal with it when you got such a traumatic and life-changing injury as that. You're talking about Curry claiming that he threw his medal over the fence and then having it displayed on the wall. And that goes to show the change in attitude depending on who essentially wins. And I think that people won the war of public opinion, the anti-war people, back during the Vietnam era, because now it's politically beneficial to claim you were a part of it. It might not have been back then, but now up-and-coming politicians, they want to go out and say, hey, yeah, I was against the war. I questioned the U.S.'s policies. I sat there and protested, and I was with those people back then. I stood out and did the right thing. Whether or not they really did it, And I got a feeling that at some point, if we are successful in 9/11 truth, all these 5-year-olds, or not even 5-year-olds, but maybe even like 16-year-olds now who are coming up and going to become the politicians of the future, are going to be claiming that they were 9/11 truthers, that they questioned Building 7 and the Twin Towers, and whether or not they really did, they're going to claim it, because that will be the politically correct and proper thing to be associated with, because the truth is winning out slowly but surely. Let's talk about Bill's views on 9/11 and some of the work he did regarding the controlled demolitions that we saw on that day.
Well, Andy, I have to be truthful here and say that Bill and Ellen, although they lived blocks from Ground Zero, they lived at West 4th and 6th Avenue in New York, which is literally blocks away. And my understanding from people who close to Bill and Ellen, because I live in D.C. and they live in New York, but they believed for years, and the last time I saw Bill, when Ellen passed, and we had the memorial service for her several months ago. But they both believed that some of the symptoms that they felt in their bodies related to 9/11, to the dust and the toxic air that the EPA at the time claimed that it's all right to, even in the days following immediately following 9/11. You remember the EPA officer, chief, I've forgotten her name, as well as Mayor Giuliani, saying it's okay to come downtown, and they just don't come around ground zero because of all the construction, or I should say demolition. In fact, let's remember what Mayor Giuliani said, because I consider him one of the most palpable war criminals in respect of 9/11, because he said on the day of 9/11 and the following 2 days on TV, national TV, clear the rubble, clear the rubble. Well, what was he speaking of? The rubble was the remains of 3,000 people. Yes, of course, it included the towers, which were destroyed to the point of being dust. And so we could discuss that in some depth, but I'm not sure we're here to do that, except to say, I will say that Bill and Ellen did believe that their illness, part of their illness had to do with, or illnesses that killed both of them, had to do with that dust. But we didn't, unfortunately, in the 27 years of the magazine, especially after 2001, report enough on 9/11. We did on several occasions, but I wish we had done much more than we did. But our focus, of course, was and continued to be about the CIA, the FBI, the other agencies, their allied agencies like Mossad and Israel, and the other agencies that were created by the CIA around the world, that were trained, armed, and foisted on their people around the world. And that was our focus as well, I should say, expanding coverage of U.S. intervention here at home, as the movie The War at Home documented. They brought the wars home and are still doing that today, whether it was COINTELPRO by the FBI, whether it was Operation Minaret of the National Security Agency, and you name it, so many more operations domestically aimed at law-abiding citizens here at home. But I should just point out about the Vietnam War that now the Pentagon is deeply involved in a very explicit project to rewrite the history of the Vietnam War. And so the anti-war, the veterans of the anti-war movement, have understood this for what it is, and have taken up this battle to force the Pentagon, or to call out the Pentagon for trying to rewrite that history. The history that the Pentagon wants to promote is that, guess what? We won the war. Can you believe that? That the Vietnamese didn't win the war. We won the war. Well, anybody who knows that history understands the big lie that is. Just like Hitler, he used to tell the big lie, and always said, and Goebbels, his propaganda minister, said, if you tell the lie loud enough and long enough, the people begin to believe it. And that's certainly what has happened in what has become conventional wisdom in our land. So to sum up, I would say that I wish that Bill and Ellen and I had done much more on 9/11 when we were publishing the magazine, which ended in 2005. Now I am deeply involved in the 9/11 truth movement, but unfortunately Ellen and Bill have left the earth, and so I will carry on with others who I work together on this with. I just attended a conference about Saudi Arabia this past weekend, promoted by Code Pink, and this whole subject came up again, particularly about the suppressed 28 pages, which, for your listeners who don't know, are the 28 pages that George W. Bush had excised every word, not just most, every single word of 28 pages from the 9/11 Commission was removed and is now in a top secret status in a locked room inside of the Congress. There are now 45 members of Congress who have signed a bill to release the 28 pages. Those who have read it, those 45 members of Congress, to a greater or lesser extent, have stated, and I've been at their press conferences, have stated, including like Walter Jones, a Republican, who says, after reading the 28 pages, you're not allowed to take notes, by the way. You're not allowed to have a copy. You're not allowed to even take a pencil into the room. And they guard you while you're there. They watch your every move as a member of Congress. But he says, my whole understanding of U.S. involvement in this issue, that is 9/11, was transformed after reading those 28 pages. And there's two other things that he says and other members have said who've read the 28 pages. If you go to the 28-page or HR14 or 28pages.org, either of those websites, you can see those press conferences yourself. And they say, and I quote now, one, there were days, weeks, months, and years of pre-planning for 9/11. That's number one. And two, that there are several countries, including, of course, the implication being Saudi Arabia. So the 28 pages, if we can get them released, will really transform the popular understanding of what went down on September 11th, how it went down. And I remind your listeners who haven't listened to the audio tapes of the first responders inside the Twin Towers, where they say, I don't know if I'm allowed to say the F word on the air, but they said, what the F are those effing explosions? And there's a timestamp on those statements by the firefighters and the Port Authority fighter fires who were trying to rescue people. Mind you, from the 78th floor and from the heights of the Twin Towers, and it was a virtual impossibility to get out of the building at that point. In fact, they were told to stay at your workstation. That's what came over the loudspeaker system, not to go try and get out of the building, which is very odd. And then, of course, there's Building 7. Building 7 was a 47-story skyscraper, a very tall building in any place, in any city. That was the headquarters on the 27th and 28th floors of Building 7. Was the headquarters of Mayor Giuliani. It was also the headquarters of several other three-letter agencies who had offices in that building. You know who I'm talking about, FBI, CIA, and others. And that building was not hit by any airplane. All there was in Building 7 were a few small office fires. In fact, wastebaskets on fire. The firemen and women that fought that fire easily put that out, and then they were told to evacuate the building. And then the owner of the buildings, the three buildings, said on national TV to pull it. We were told to pull it. Well, pull it is a term of art in the demolitions business. When you bring down a stadium, when you bring down an office building to build something new there, and you go online, anybody can go online and look at those kinds of demolitions. For me, the hardest thing to look at in those videos is the people jumping to their death. And you see that, and just imagine what it took. I mean, that's what they felt they had to do, because they knew they weren't going to survive the fires, and so they jumped.
I was going to say, I talked to somebody today, a big supporter of AE 9/11 Truth, who happened to be there and was working there in some kind of official capacity as a rescue worker, and is traumatized permanently by the jumpers, by seeing those people coming down. Bill and Ellen were there too. That was like right near them. These people were big supporters of AE. So I just want to throw that out there, because when somebody comes up at the AIA convention and says, "Oh, I was there, can't we put this behind us?" That's not really a logical argument and argument on the side of the official story. We have plenty of people who were there as well. And you bring up the 28 pages. I just want to remind our audience, AE 9/11 Truth has called for that 9/11 or Transparency for the Families of 9/11 Victims Act to be expanded to include issues surrounding Building 7, like releasing the input data, so that they can't keep it under lock and key and just tell us to take their word for it that they didn't manipulate it in some way. Factoring in the omitted building features that were left out. I mean, the whole list is there, and it's going to be published again at some point. But what gets me about this whole issue with 9/11, and really kind of brings home the old joke the old line from the Watchmen about once you realize how much of a joke everything is, being the comedian is the only thing that makes sense, is just how they're able to keep everything classified. You're a U.S. congressman, you're not allowed to take notes, and they're allowed to say this to somebody who is an elected official of like one of the highest bodies in the land. The fact that they're able to redact information when, even if you believe the official story of 9/11, it would still be a huge government screw-up. And whenever I screw up at work, I'm not allowed to keep stuff secret. You got to report to your bosses. Supposedly, the American people are the bosses, so the American people should have that information. It just amazes me how this stuff is so manipulated and so, I guess, just how we are so patronized by this establishment. And 9/11 is a perfect example of that. We've talked about it for years on this show. You were going to say something?
Well, to keep the big lie alive, they have to keep so much of the secrets. I'm certainly not in agreeing with that, but that's how they keep the lie alive. That's why, even though public opinion surveys have shown that a very large number of the American electorate and American people do not believe the official story, or at least know that the government has lied to them, they don't know or have not studied all the videos and all the documents that there are out there, which aren't enough. But they know that the official story is not possible. But I think it's also a fact that the way that you keep a big lie like that is the official story of 9/11, keep it as what we know as conventional wisdom, you have to continue to lie to people, and you have to continue to, meaning the government, has to continue to disinform, to, in the case like I mentioned about the Vietnam War, to rewrite the history, or the perpetrators of 9/11, some of whom we know their names, whether it's the neocons who were around George W. Bush, whether it was Dick Cheney, and not a single one of them has done 1 hour in prison as a result of 9/11. And I think we as the people out here who are fighting for the truth about 9/11 have to press for those people, and there's a list of them, people know who they are, to be prosecuted over 9/11.
Well, and at the very least, to be accountable. I mean, even if you believe the official story of 9/11, if you're one of those people who thinks that physics stood down on 9/11, because it was a very shocking day, the 9/11 hijackers had that power. they still have to be accountable for the screw-ups. They still have to answer to the American people. And so on the issue of Building 7, for instance, leaving out the stiffener plates and leaving out the shear studs on the girder to try to make some hypothesis happen is anti-science, anti-a real investigation, so they should rerun the analysis. And if you really agree with the official story of 9/11, you should still sign the petition at ae911truth.org because they never did a real investigation to begin with. You want to stand with science. You talk about history being rewritten. I think that's really interesting, too, because I'm a big fan of history. I used to read my history textbook in high school like it was a novel. I pretend like I didn't know what was going to happen, and I just enjoyed it. But, a lot of it was propaganda. I didn't know that at the time. But they make you memorize dates. And I'll be honest, folks, I have no idea what date Abraham Lincoln was shot. I know it was in April 1860-something. I can't tell you for the life of me what day it was, but I do know the circumstances behind it. I know the story of it. And I think something that they should be teaching in history books instead of just trying to make people memorize dates like a computer is to actually teach you the nature of history and how history is malleable based off of who is telling it to you, who is shaping an agenda at that point and trying to portray a certain history to you. And I think approaching history in that way would help at least, 40% of solving a lot of our problems going forward, making the public a lot smarter.
Well, Americans are known for one thing, which is pathetic, and that is they don't have a memory. And I include myself. I don't, a lot of things which I'm going through in my 75th year of loss of memory, but I'm talking about historical memory. And you may not remember, I don't remember the day that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. Of course, there's the question that always the joke. I think it's a foul joke, but the joke, Mrs. Clinton, did you like what did you think of the play? It's like it's an effort which we should deplore, and not just that joke, but I'm saying in general the fact that the large swath of Americans do not have a memory of our history and the nature of our history of intervening all over the world and creating other countries in our image. I have to remind people that every president in my lifetime always says these magic words, if indeed they are magic, and I quote, "The United States is the greatest nation on the face of the earth," unquote. Well, that kind of leaves out over 100 other countries, right? Kind of turns them into chopped liver or something. And I've lived in various countries overseas and have seen how people think about us, the United States, people of the United States. I know when John F. Kennedy was president, I know when Barack Obama was first elected, there was some notion in the minds of some that this might be a different time in space, in our history. Well, it didn't exactly turn out that way, and I fault Obama as much as anybody on this score. I think he made a lot of false promises, but I also have to remember that he is surrounded, and to a large extent he surrounded himself with people, some of whom came out directly out of the prior Bush administration, particularly at the CIA, John Brennan, for example, and so many others. And so, is it any surprise that Obama, and he's done some good things, I think, we don't have time to list everything good and bad that he's done, but I think it's fair to say that he's done some things, but the fact is that, and one of the candidates, I think her name begins with H, is known for, and her husband, as having put in place the crime bill that resulted in mass incarceration. He took away the Glass-Steagall Act. He took away welfare systems that so many people, including predominantly children, depended on for food, and so much more. And so, but then she says, well, I'm a woman. I deserve to go to the White House. Well, I'm afraid she's got more than a few skeletons in her closet. I have a video of her proudly saying that we, in this case the United States, have after the earthquake that in Haiti that killed 300,000 people in 33 seconds. She says we, and it's on this video, we have rebuilt the clothing industry in Haiti. Well, what is the clothing industry in Haiti, where people are paid cents, as little as 80 or 60 cents an hour, or even less, and they're not allowed to speak their own language on the job, and so forth and so on. She is not exactly someone who can brag about what she stands for. I wish Bernie Sanders would stand up on some of the foreign policy issues, which he's largely silent about. And his support of Israel is, to me, unacceptable. But, it's not all about Donald Trump. Donald Trump was quoted saying, and I saw him on video saying, with his hand up in the air, pointing at some figure off in the distance, I could kill somebody on the street here in New York, and I wouldn't go to jail. Is that something to be proud of? Or him saying he doesn't know the founder of one of the founders of the Ku Klux Klan and the modern Ku Klux Klan, David Duke. He doesn't even know who's David Duke. Come on, give me a break. But now, as I understand today, he's now come out again for torture and waterboarding. He wants to legalize and rebuild the justifications for the use of torture. Well, I would suggest that even though Barack Obama said in his very first week in August, the United States doesn't torture. Well, we found out that was a lie, right? So, there's so many lies that hold the official story, whether it's 9/11 or the official story of U.S. history, up as truth. When you begin to look a little closer, you know that there's not truth there.
And folks, this is relevant because obviously a lot of this, the torture and the U.S. foreign policy is based off of 9/11. 9/11 is still used to justify what's taking place. Sometimes I hear people come up with this hope that Donald Trump is going to somehow have a new investigation into 9/11, and everything I've heard him say makes it sound to me like he believes the official story hook, line, and sinker, and is ready to take George Bush's agenda and put it into hyperdrive. That's what it sounds like to me. But getting back to 9/11, the big issue, the issue the show is focused on, beyond just people commiserating on the internet about the situation and priding themselves on knowing a lot about the evidence of controlled demolition on that day, what are some things that you and Bill discovered in the real world are the most effective ways to really put a black eye on the system and get action on an issue like this? Because you guys were information warriors back before there was an internet. So give us your wisdom moving forward from what you guys found with the Covert Action magazine and the other stuff that you guys have done. What are some ways, some lessons we can apply to the 9/11 issue to really make a difference?
Well, thank you very much, Andy, for this question. I would suggest that our effort was to try and get the very best writers, investigative journalists and writers and historians to write for our magazine and other magazines as well, like The Nation and others. Very good. We didn't compete with anyone else. We never saw ourselves in competition with any other journals. But I would point out, in case you don't know, or your listeners don't know, that Ellen and Bill co-founded another journal in 1986 called Lies of Our Times. And this was a magazine of media criticism that analyzed the underlying political assumptions and biases of the New York Times. It was a great journal, it really was, and not just the New York Times, but other mainstream media, but largely was directed at the New York Times. At one point, somebody contributed to them money enough to put up a billboard on 6th Avenue, which about Lies of Our Times, and the New York Times tried to have it removed, but and Bill, with his legal skills, managed to fight that successfully. They also founded in 1988, co-sponsored at this was in their capacity as the founders of the Institute for Media Analysis, a major conference at Harvard University on what was called the history and consequences of anti-communism in the United States. It was attended by over 1,500 people, and among the presentations there were by many scholars, including Howard Zinn, Jessica Mitford, Ring Lardner, John Henry Falk, Stephen Jay Gould, John Kenneth Galbraith, Daniel Ellsberg, Blanche Wiesen-Cook, Chetty Jagan, Leonard Boudin, and many others. I just can't honor them enough for what they did. Aside from what we did together, I attended that conference, but I wasn't involved in organizing, and I made the coffee and so forth, but I wasn't one of the people organizing the conference. So they really did so much, and to answer your question directly, I think that's what requires us as activists, as anti-imperialists, as historians of our real history, not the official histories, because the official history of so many events in our history almost every single time turns out to be a lie. So that we have to understand that principle, that fact. All you have to look at is whether it's the Vietnam War, whether it's the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which was the basis for the beginning of launching the Vietnam War, whether it's 9/11 itself. The official story falls apart if you look closer, if you take the microscope and look at it. This is the sad fact that the official history always really has holes in it. And so as activists, as journalists, as historians, we must make it our mission to not lose sight of this fact, to always be researching in that direction to find out the truth. Whether it's about 9/11, because it's going to take a lot more research to really get at the truth of what happened on 9/11. It may be like the Kennedy assassination, but the fact is that the official history is written by our enemies in most cases, not by people who understand and stand for the truth. So we really have to understand that.
Lou Wolf, thank you so much for coming on 9/11 Freefall.
Thank you so much, Andy. It was a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you.
This program's on every Thursday night on No Lies Radio at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. You can also download MP3s of the show from the Internet Archive by going to 911freefall.com. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week and good luck.